this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Corsair H100i Elite all-in-one cooler. This is the 240mm version of the Elite cooler, which is also available in other sizes, including 280 and 360mm. It comes with Corsair's AF120 Elite fans, and you can see me here in this video changing those fans out for the white versions. As standard, this kit comes with the black fans and the black cooler, and as you can see has RGB lighting on the pump head itself, but not on the fans. So you have 16 LED RGBs around the ring or square of the pump head, and I'm going to show you the setup process for this all-in-one cooler with a couple of different setups. The installation process for Intel setups with an LGA 1200 or an LGA 1700 socket motherboard. And if you have an Intel 12th gen motherboard, you'll be pleased to hear that this not only supports LGA 1700, but comes with the necessary stuff included in the box. It also has, obviously, the usual AMD AM4 brackets and such, but I'm not going to be covering the AMD setup here. I'm focusing on Intel because that's the build I'm doing. And so if you have an Intel build and you want to see the process for installing this all-in-one cooler and how you go about it, then stick with me because I'm going to cover off a lot of different things, including setup in the software, benchmarks later on, and the installation with the different brackets, as well as how to install different fans. Now, as I said, it comes with Corsair's AF120 Elite cooling fans, and these are fluid dynamic bearing fans, which are PWM controllable, and they're designed to run nice and quietly. They also have a 0 RPM mode that you can use when connected up to the pump head, and also that you can run these at quite low volumes, which is pretty nice, but they are also obviously designed to deliver superior cooling performance without any RGB lighting. In the box you'll find the necessary backplate that I showed there a second ago, and a number of different standoff screws for various different Intel sockets, and you'll see the LGA 1700 there, but there is also the standoff screws necessary for 1200, 1156, 2066 and others. So I'm going to show you the installation process, which is mostly the same, to be fair. Now, this is a pre-filled all-in-one liquid cooler, so it comes with the necessary coolant already pre-installed inside, and it also has pre-applied thermal paste that you can see on the copper block there, which means that you don't need any thermal paste. You don't have to worry about that. You can just set this up, connect it up to your CPU and your motherboard, and you're away, basically. So I'm going to show you the process for doing that. A nifty little cooler, nice looking, subtle RGB lighting, and a reasonably easy setup process. It might seem a bit intimidating if you're new to this and this is the first time you've got it out of the box, because there is a lot of different things going on here, but you won't need a lot of it. You can push the AMD stuff out of the way for a start, and then you just need to work out what socket you're going to be using on Intel to connect up. Now, I'm also trying to work out the orientation of the radiator in this. I've done a video separately on the best orientation and what you should avoid. I'm top mounting in this case because that's the best position for a 240mm in the case that I'm using, which is a DeepCool CK560WH, which is a mid-tower case, and I've done a video separately, a build guide on that. And also going to be doing some more content on it in the near future when I've swapped out for the AF120 Elite fans. But I'm trying to work out the positioning of the pump, and this is basically the logic you need to do, and I recommend thinking about this before you do it. So I'm going to mount it top mounted with the tubes on the left hand side, but you also have the option to potentially mount them on the right hand side. Depending on the aesthetic you're going for, it doesn't really matter. You just need to make sure that you have enough space. So here you can see all the different things laid out, and I'm going to quickly give you an overview of various things. You'll notice, for example, on the pump head itself, there's a USB-C connection. This is a nice upgrade from Corsair because it was previously micro USB connection, but you have this bundled cable with a lot of different cables on it and a USB-C connection. Now, the bonus here is that you can actually put this in two different directions, which is useful, and I'll show you why that is later on and how that works. Once you've connected this up, that then allows you to do a variety of other things, including connecting the fans up. So you can see on the breakout cable that you have two cables here marked 1 and 2. Those are essentially for the two fans that are included. So you connect up the two fans to the radiator, and then you plug the two fans into these connections, and then that's connected up to the pump head, and then the pump head then has control over the fans and the fan speed via Corsair's iCUE software, which I'll show you later on. So that means you get full control over the PWM, so that means you have speed control in a variety of ways over the two fans. It also makes it a lot easier because you don't then need to worry about where to plug the fans in as well as where to plug the pump into. And so this sort of setup makes it really straightforward. There's also a USB connection which plugs in on the bottom of your motherboard usually. You can see me doing it here. You usually find that you have two USB connections on the bottom. Don't get those confused with the USB front panel connections for your case, because they are in a different position and they're a different shape, so you can't actually get them wrong. But you'll see them down the bottom here. On this NZXT motherboard that I'm showing, it actually has three, but usually they're at the bottom and in the middle. The other cable that you have is the flat SATA power cable. This is what gives the pump and the fans the power that it needs, so you'll need a flat connection from your power supply unit. Here you can see a clip from a video I did on the RM750 from Corsair. This is a 750 watt power supply unit. And those SATA cables are used for a variety of things, including, as I'm showing here, the Corsair Commander Core, which is a fan controller that I'm not actually using in this build, but I just wanted to demonstrate the different uses for this cable. So it's also used for SSDs, hard disk drives, and in this case, for the pump head on the cooler. So it's a really straightforward setup with a very flat connector, but it's really important that you plug this in because that obviously gives the power. The next one is this tiny little connector, and that connects up in different places depending on your motherboard. You will have options. You can see here on this 1200 socket motherboard that I have a CPU fan connector at the top just above the CPU. That is the best option on this motherboard, but you may find that you either have CPU fan or you have AIO fan or water cooling pump fan connections. There's a variety of different options. On this NZXT ones, for example, you'll see there's CPU fan and AIO pump. So you have two different options in what to connect it up to. You could go for AIO pump. Sometimes some motherboards will give you a fan warning about that. It doesn't really matter in my experience which one you plug it into. It just gives the motherboard control over it and knowledge of what's going on with the pump head. And it will work still as long as you plug in the USB connection and connect up to either of those. But I would tend to go to CPU fan as the logical option. So again, working out the positioning of where the pump's going to go, where the cables are going to be, and also where the radiator is going to sit. This is important because we're trying to also assess where we're going to position the fans. So what I want to do is put the fans in a position where they're going to be exhausting air out of the case, because it's obviously going upwards towards the top. Hot air rises naturally, so what you want to do is position the fans in a way that they will suck air out through the radiator, cooling the radiator down and the liquid inside on the way out. Now, air travels through fans from the front to the rear, so it gets sucked through. So what you need to do is put the fans face down as they would be facing towards into the case, or in this case facing towards me at the moment because I'm mounting it in this direction. Also, take note of the way I've put the cables, because I've essentially set this up so that the cables are going to be pointing towards the back of the case. This means that you can run the cables to the back, keep things nice and tidy at the front. From the accessories bag, you'll see that there are a number of different screws, and you want the long ones, and there are a lot of them. There are happily enough to do push-pull, so if you happen to have two extra fans, you could put fans on both sides. It's not necessary, but it is an option, and Corsair have included enough screws to be able to do that if you want to. Position those screws into the fans themselves and the various holes that are on there. Obviously you have 8 screws if you're installing 2 fans, so you just need to make sure that they're screwed into the holes that are drilled into the radiator. Nice and easy process, much smoother than it used to be, thank you Corsair. And then onto the back plate. So this is a bracket that goes on the back of your motherboard, unless you're using LGA 2066. And the points, as you can see, move in and out. And this is important because different sockets have different holes in different positions, and you need to reposition these according to which motherboard you have. Now, this is an LGA 1700 socket motherboard from Asus, but what you will notice is there's actually 2 holes. Essentially, the holes are elongated, because what they've done is they've made this motherboard so that it will work with LGA 1200 socket backplates, which is interesting. So remove the 3M sticky tape from here, and you then have a bit of a sticky back plastic affair on the backplate. That just essentially holds it in place a little bit easier. Position those little standoff screws into the right place so that they will fit through the holes, and then basically secure that down by just gently pressing on it so the stick will stick to the back of the motherboard and hold it in place temporarily. We're then going to flip the motherboard over and put in the standoffs. Now, it's worth noting that I'm showing a lot of this outside of the case because it's easier just to demonstrate this on video. You may well choose to do this while your motherboard is already installed in the case. As long as you have access to the back of the motherboard, that's not a problem. Now you can see that the different screws are in different positions because I have those two holes. This means that I'm using a screwdriver to adjust them into the right place. It's a little bit fiddly, but essentially we need to make sure that they're in the right place in each corner, and that will ensure that the CPU pump has a good clearance and coverage on the CPU and is actually in the right place to connect up with it nicely and give us the cooling that we need. So adjusting them all into the right position, and then find the LGA 1700 standoff screws. They're clearly marked in the bag, as you can see, and they are different. So it is important to use these standoff screws and not get confused and use the others because they're different sizes, which means that the way that it sits on the motherboard will be ever so slightly different. If you use the wrong ones, you might not have good contact with the pump head and the CPU, therefore giving you cooling that isn't quite as effective. So just note the length of these and also the type. And this is obviously, as I said, for LGA 1700. In a minute, I'll show you LGA 1200, and there are standoffs included for a lot of different sockets as well. So be sure to check out the manual. By the way, if you need to see it, when you open the case up, you'll see there's a QR code on the box itself. You can scan that with a QR reader and it'll take you right to the website to download the manual on your phone so you can easily access it and get an idea of how to do it if the steps are different, if you have a different setup to me. But hopefully this video will cover off everything you need to know. Then put those standoff screws into each corner and tighten them up so that it's nice and tight and it's basically holding the backplate in place nicely and nothing's going to move around. So now in theory, what we would end up with is this is the end result, and we're pretending now that it's in the case. You'd put the pump head down over that, remembering to take off the plastic shield, and then you'd use the thumb screws to tighten it down. I'm not actually building an LGA 1700 motherboard here. I'm actually going to be using 1200. So this is an NZXT motherboard. The reason for that is I'm just building this for somebody, but I wanted to demonstrate the different processes for it. Again, so we were going to position the points in here for the LGA 1200 on the backplate. And it's the same sort of logic here. We're basically going to connect up the backplate to the rear. Again, you have that sticky contact in the middle where you've peeled off the cover, and you can basically just put it down, seat it down, and then you will be able to ensure that it stays in place while you're screwing in the standoffs. This makes life a little bit easier and ensures that everything is where it should be when you're going about this process. And it is much easier also if your case is standing up and you're trying to do this, because that will ensure that the backplate doesn't fall off annoyingly. But once you start to put the standoffs in, it'll also hold it in place. So now we're looking for the Intel 11.5X/1200. That's because it'll work with 1150 and 1156 and other variations of LGA sockets, but in this case we want the 1200. You'll notice the difference between these standoffs and the ones for the LGA 1700. They have a little sort of bit around the middle where there's an edge cut out of them, and they are ever so slightly different in terms of the length on either side, so it's important to make sure you find the right ones. So LGA 1200 standoffs now screwed into each corner. Now, as I mentioned earlier on in the video, I'm using Corsair's AF120 Elite fans in white for the rest of the case. So you can see that I have 3 fans set on intake on the front of the case, and then I'm putting 1 fan exhausting out of the rear. The plan is then to install the motherboard and also to install the cooler on the top of the case. Now, because I'm using white fans, it makes sense to replace the included white fans with Corsair's AF120 Elite fans in white instead of black. So the only difference is they're white instead of black. However, it is worth noting that you can swap the fans out for any that you like to match the rest of your case. I have done this in the past, for example, with Corsair's QL120 fans to add in some nice RGB lighting to a reasonably affordable cooler. LL120s, ML120s, and you can also use fans from other brands if you like. So if you wanted to put on some Lee fans, for example, which are fantastic, by the way, the new Infinity fans are awesome. You do have that option, and you could do that, and that's a nice way to match your fans from your case and your cooler at once and make sure that everything looks the same. The cooling performance on these fans, though, is obviously superior to most other fans. They're designed especially for airflow, and that's the focus here. So you probably want to keep that in mind when you're doing this. Now, for this process, I'm installing the motherboard in here and showing a little bit of a snippet of this. Again, if you want to see the full sort of installation process for this case or how to go about it, I'll link to that video in the description so you can see the build for this case and how that worked if you're curious, and that will show you the other steps that you'd go through. But again, I'm just checking my logic and making sure that it will indeed fit where I want it to. I know that you can fit this size of radiator on the top, but I just want to make sure that the tubes for the cooler are okay on the left hand side. You can see that they're quite close to the rear fan, but that's not necessarily a problem. And I could potentially have faced it the other way around and had them sitting on the right hand side where there's a bit more space. You have the option to do either. It doesn't really matter. It's a personal preference. And in this instance, I decided to make them sit on the left. The next thing is to go back to the accessories bag and look for the tiny little screws that are included in there along with the washers. These are for mounting the radiator to the case itself. So you put these screws through the washers and then through the top of the case in the right place to screw it down. Here you can see some of that process here. And again, there are lots of them. You have 8 screws to screw in to secure it into place. I'd recommend lightly doing this when you start. Just make sure you screw them all in, but don't tighten them fully, because what you might find is you want to adjust the radiator ever so slightly to the left or to the right to position the tubes so they're not getting in the way of things. You might find you might want to move it a little bit to the right to get away from that rear fan, for example. Or if you've got it the other way around, you might want to push it one way or the other to move the pump and the cables away from the radiator a bit. So that's something to bear in mind. But now we have it installed and screwed in. Remember to take off this plastic shielding, obviously. And then, as I said, you don't need to apply thermal paste because it's already pre-applied to the pump head. So now what we need to do is seat that pump head down onto the CPU and then use the thumb screws to hold it down in place. So carefully and gently place that pump head down, ensuring that you're sitting the notches on the sides over the standoffs that we've already applied. And then you need to find the thumb screws and screw them down. Obviously, you need to make some amount of pressure on here, but be careful not to over tighten them. I'd start with opposite corners because that allows you to secure them in both positions. So you can see me doing top left and bottom right here. And then once that's done, you can put on the other ones and then basically just make sure you go through the process of tightening all of these up carefully. You'll notice that they do have a screw hole in the top, so you could use a screwdriver. However, I've found it's better to do it with just your hand because you don't want to risk over tightening it and damaging the motherboard, because you can potentially damage the pins on the motherboard that connect up to the CPU if you apply too much pressure here. You do, however, need to make sure that it's tight enough so that there's good contact between the copper plate and the top of the CPU, because otherwise you won't get the cooling that you want. So if you find that it's running a bit hot, it might well be because you haven't tightened it up enough. So that's worth keeping in mind. Other potential problems I've seen is that during the installation process, some of the thermal paste was damaged and it doesn't fully apply to the top of the CPU and therefore it doesn't cool it. Now, another thing that you'll notice that's pretty neat about this is that the Corsair logo that sits on the top is held on with magnets, and you can actually turn it around and reposition it. Why is this useful? Well, it means that you can put the pump in a variety of positions. I could, for example, have mounted it with the tubes on the bottom or on the left-hand side, and into different positions depending on where the radiator's mounted. This gives you some flexibility because then you can basically just change the Corsair logo around by taking it off with the magnets. Now here's again another look at the USB-C cable connection I was talking about. Because it's USB-C, you can plug it in one direction and have the cables face off to the right in this instance. But then I realized that they were going to get in the way of the RAM, and look, if you start to push it up there, it sort of comes out a little bit from the pump head, and I didn't really like that. I thought that wasn't ideal necessarily. But the good news is, because it's USB-C, I can turn it around and face it the other way, so we can have it pushed towards the back of the case instead. Again, depending on how you've mounted the pump, this will be in a slightly different position, so you can then account for that. And I think it's a nice upgrade that they've moved from micro USB to USB-C on something so straightforward. Now, once again, obviously, I've got to go through the process of what I showed earlier on with all these different cables, connecting them up. And one thing of note is it was really fiddly to run it to the back. So that's worth bearing in mind. It might be worth plugging in the cables and running them back through to the back before you install the radiator to the top of the motherboard. And thinking about the logic of how to do this, and depends on your motherboard, but there wasn't much room to maneuver cables back through those holes. The other thing I've got to do is to run the 2 CPU fan cables from the radiator to the rear as well. This will allow me to tidy up things because, as I showed earlier, essentially those 2 fan cables connect up to the 2 cables coming out of the breakout cable from the pump head. And obviously you can see there's quite an excess of cabling back here that you don't really want at the front of your case. So you run it to the back and then you find a suitable spot where you can plug it in and then cable tidy it. So tie them down to loops within the case, or use some channeling depending on what case you're using to make sure that they're positioned nicely and out of the way where they won't get in any sort of bother, whether it's sitting on the back of the motherboard or causing issues. Down the bottom you can see that I have my flat SATA power connectors plugged in down here, and I'm going to connect that up now. Again, this is really important to make sure that power is connected up from the pump head to your SATA power connection, because that gives the power to both the fan and to the pump, so it won't run if you don't plug that in. Then the USB cable goes through in the middle from the rear, and that is connected up at the bottom of the motherboard. So bottom middle roughly is where the USB cable plugs in. Again, not to be confused with the front panel USB, which you can see on the right hand side just below the 24-pin power supply cable. And once again, you have the choice of either AIO or CPU fan. Now, one of the things that I have found here in this process, and that you may well find as well, is because of the way I set mine up and because of the design of this case and the sort of shielding on the motherboard, it was really difficult to plug the CPU fan in now. It's very difficult to sort of negotiate that cable into the right place. If you have smaller hands, you might not have an issue. I was thinking that I would have to unscrew the radiator and take the entire thing off, still leaving the pump in place, to be able to then plug that cable in and then put the radiator back. It would have been a real faff, but luckily I managed to just about fit it in. But a word of warning, just bear that in mind. If you're building in a smaller case, that might potentially be an issue. So you may well want to do this in a slightly different order in terms of perhaps installing the pump first and then the radiator afterwards once you've installed all the cables. That might make life a little bit easier. So here's the end result now. And you can see some very subtle RGB lighting because I only have it on the Kingston Fury RAM and on the Corsair H100i Elite pump head. And you will notice that perhaps that USB-C cable doesn't look that great this way around, so I'm not really sure what the best solution is there. I could perhaps have turned the pump in a different direction and positioned that cable in perhaps a nicer way. This is going to vary depending on your setup, but I think that the overall result looks pretty nice. It's a very understated and subtle build, and also the cooling performance isn't to be understated either. Very nice at cooling, and very quiet too. As I said already, 0 RPM on the fans, so you can run that really nicely. And what I've found so far is a very quiet setup and very nice looking. So stick with me now as I go into the software and other things. So here I am now in Windows, and I'm running Cinebench R23 with several different passes. You can see on the right hand side, I'm running Corsair's iCUE software and hardware monitor because I wanted to basically be able to show a test of the performance. Now this is a 11th gen CPU, an i7 11700K, and with several passes on Cinebench, I got about a maximum temperature around 71 degrees C, which is actually really good. Obviously, with any benchmarking, you need to take it with a pinch of salt because it will vary depending on the setup of your case, your fans, your environment, and all sorts of other things. But this is actually a really good temperature, and to be fair, the fans didn't ramp up to super high levels at any point. So it was still running nice and quietly despite this pressure. Now, Cinebench is a synthetic benchmark tool which puts your CPU under a lot more pressure than you usually get from gaming and such. So it's actually a really good way to test out whether you're performing well and the current temperatures that you're running at. So I'd actually recommend downloading it for free and testing it out after you've installed to make sure that the temps aren't running too high. 70 is good. So now we're into Corsair's iCUE software. This gives you some various different controls over things like the lighting effects, which I'll get to in a minute. But what I want to quickly demonstrate is that if you go into the cooling section, you can see that you can set the fans to various different speeds, including 0 RPM, and the pump to quiet. You also can choose balanced and performance mode depending on what you need and the levels of sound that you want. If you go back into lighting, you'll see there's a variety of different lighting effects, and you can choose from watercolor, which is probably the nicest, rainbow, color wave, color warp, marquee, rain, and other sorts. Now, this obviously only applies to the pump head, the ring around the outside, and the lighting in the middle, which lights up the logo. The RGB is kind of limited here, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it because obviously there's no fans, and you do have 16 RGB LEDs, and it does look nice, but the various different effects don't really add that much extra to the case, I don't think. There's two different sections for lighting effects, though. The standard lighting effects, where you can choose from a variety of different ones, including the color and speed and other things, and hardware lighting. Hardware lighting is used for when Corsair's iCUE software isn't running. So, for example, if your PC's locked. One of the nice things that you will notice is you can set the lighting so it changes color depending on your CPU temperature, so your system temperatures, which can be a useful gauge of the current performance and how things are going. Otherwise, that's the setup for iCUE, and this has been a full and hopefully in-depth look at the Corsair H100i. If you found it useful, smash that subscribe button, the like, and let me know in the comments what you think. Head over to my Discord if you've got any questions, which is all linked in the description, and check out everything down there to find out more. Also, a big shout out to my YouTube members who help support the channel. If you've enjoyed this content or any of the other content that I'm putting out, why don't you consider clicking that join button to find out the benefits? Thanks for watching. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Hope you found this video useful, interesting, hilarious, or otherwise. Take a look at these other videos that I think you might find interesting as well. And have a look at the description for links and other information you might find useful. Click that join button to see the benefits of being a member of my YouTube channel. And most importantly, have a great life.